We're here interviewing Mark Allison. I met him at Havasu 95 Speedway in his number 5 white late model, and he's joined us this year in the Lucas Oil Modified Series. This is his car, and we're just here to chit chat, ask a few questions, get to know him a little better. How you doing, Mark?
Good.
All right, so what age did you start racing?
I started racing motorcycles as a teenager. I ran my first stock car race at the age of 20 in 1978.
And you got into circle track?
My dad raced. I grew up around race cars. And the reason I got into motorcycles is as a teenager, that's the only thing you could even remotely race. You couldn't get in a car until you were 16 years old. Couldn't get in the pits till then. So once I was old enough to build my own race car and get in the pits and do my own thing, I started right out of high school building my first race car. So yeah, I started my first oval track race at Craig Road Speedway in 1978.
And where is that?
Craig Road Speedway is a little quarter-mile track here in Las Vegas. It's been closed down for many years, but it was a really cool little racetrack. A lot of famous racers. Mark Martin raced there, Dick Trickle raced there, Larry Phillips raced there, Larry Deachins, a lot of the great guys, everybody from the West Coast. Travis Thurkettle's dad, Jim, raced there. I saw him race at the old Craig Road Speedway.
So your dad was pretty much your influence for getting into it?
Yeah, if your tour of the shop, you saw some of the pictures he raced 57 Chevys. My dad did. So, yeah.
So that's the reason I can't have one as a hot rod, because you guys messed them all up.
That's about it. Yeah, my dad kind of got me into racing. He, as a kid, I couldn't wait to get out of school and go over there at the shop and just clean parts or do whatever, sweep the floor, whatever a teenage kid could do. They didn't let me do anything important on the race car back then.
How'd your very first race go?
I guess it went okay. My first race was with my first car that I built, which was a 65 Chevelle at Craig Road Speedway, little quarter-mile paved track. I qualified second slowest, started outside front row of the main event, and kind of traded paint with the guy on the pole a little bit, and we finished all right. I mean, first race ever. It was a little bit of a learning curve, but it was okay. I was excited to do it. It was thrilling, and I couldn't wait to come back and race as many races as I could that year. But we came back the following year in 1979 and won Rookie of the Year, and they called them limited stocks, and finished third in the points. We set the track record a few times, set fast time a few times, won some main events. And I had some good people that helped me figure out the car, even though I was a little green at building it.
Was that the only track you ran at your first year?
No. In 78, the first year I raced, yes. In 79, we went to a track up in Utah and ran one race up there. At a young age, I knew I wanted to travel to different tracks. So we went to a track called Santana Raceway. I want to say just outside of Provo, Utah. They had the same rules, so we towed our car all the way up there and raced in Utah. And I think we finished 4th or 5th that race.
Would you say what class it was?
They called them limited stocks.
Limited stocks.
Yeah, you had a roll cage. You could have jack and bolts and remount the shocks, but they basically were full frame cars. Like I said, my first one was a 65 Chevelle. Everyone wants to choke me now for turning that thing into a race car, but that was my first race car.
Getting in any fights?
What's that?
Getting any fights in the pits? First few years? No,
I was able to kind of talk my way out of them. As a young kid, most of the guys, the older guys that were winning races, the established guys, they had reputations of being pretty good fighters too, so you just knew who to avoid. But even back then, I tried to race pretty clean. I figure you got to just beat them. Don't rough them up. Don't try to push them or move them, as they say today. Just pass them. And I've always kind of held true to that. Just try to pass people.
That first track, was it a one-group track, or was it pretty easy to get around people?
It had a preferred groove. It was similar in nature to Havasu, a little more banking, but if you were good and had a good setup and could drive smooth, you could pass people on the outside. Because a lot of people would, when they go defensive, holding the bottom, they slow down to make sure they can hold that bottom, which makes them easier to get around on the outside. And once you get up door to door with them and you pinch their exit and entry on a turn, they're easy to pass. And once I learned how to do that, and I had some help from a guy back then named Danny Pike and a guy named Phil Hayes, kind of coached me a little bit in the driving aspect on how to be a two-footed driver, how to be smooth and things like that. So I had some good advice when I was coming up in racing.
What was your pit crew like?
My pit crew? It's the same pit crew I have today. We all went to high school together and we've raced together off and on. Different things have happened in their life where they've been in and out for a year or two here or there, but most of the 39 years I've been racing has been with Kirk and Glenn. I did race with a guy named Dan Geiger for 15 years, and him and I together had some phenomenal seasons. We won, I believe it's 11 track championships together, a IMCA regional championship. We won a winter series. We won our share of the what they call big money races, $5,000, $10,000 to win races. And the ones we didn't win, we did real well in.
What was your favorite track in the 70s?
Boy, that's a tough one because I ran Riverside and Sears Point in my Southwest Tour car. I really liked road racing. So I'd almost have to say I probably liked Riverside better than I did Sears Point. But road racing, I really liked road racing. But I fell in love with 1 Mile Phoenix the first time I went there to watch. Growing up running on a quarter-mile track, it was amazing when they built Mesa Marin. It was a half-mile track. I watched my dad race at the old Irwindale. Back then they called it San Gabriel Valley Motor Speedway.
Speedway 605?
Yeah, 605. It was a half-mile track. But when I went to Phoenix and saw a mile paved track, I was like, oh, I got to come back and race on this track. So I really liked Phoenix. It was sad that we didn't get to race enough there. They only had, back then they had the Copper World Classic once a year. And I only ran there twice in my whole career at Phoenix. But I liked Phoenix. But I'd have to say road racing, Riverside was probably my favorite track.
Me and my dad moved to California in 73. And Gerchman was running, I want to say Claimer stock, but I'm not sure.
Claimers were a popular car back then because they're kind of like what a bomber car is today, I think. You just get a car, put a cage in it. If it's got a good running motor, put some decent tires on it and you race it. I think Craig Road had a Claimer class for like $300. You could claim someone's car and race it the next week. So it was a real inexpensive way to get in racing.
Were you guys at Speedway 605, 73, 74, 75?
I was just a kid when my dad raced there because my dad raced at the Orange Show, he raced at 605, and he raced at Corona. And a lot of times they would run the same car. Back then they ran the same car on the dirt and the pavement. They'd just make some minor changes to them and run the same car. And I remember going to the different tracks, but as a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, I can't remember. I was just excited to be able to go to the races with them. Yeah.
What track did you hate the most in the 70s?
Hate the most?
Which one did you just not like going to?
As a kid, I was so excited to go to the races. I don't think I really had a track I didn't like to go to. I always wanted, if there was room in the truck, and I remember riding in the back of the truck to a lot of races, just, hey, you can go, but you're riding in the back. Well, I'm going. I want to go. And they, as a 10, 11-year-old boy, I remember many a time sitting at the Orange Show in the grandstands by myself, and I'd sit on the pit side so I could go up to the top and look over and watch them work on the cars and stuff, which is still like that today. The Orange Show, I liked going to the Orange Show because it was a fun track to go to as a kid.
So you remember the telephone poles?
I remember the telephone poles. I actually have the programs that I got there as a kid from the Orange Show, I still have them in my collection of racing stuff. And it's one of the covers of the program had a jar and it said termites on it. And it showed these little termite-looking creatures, cartoon written. And it says, "We gotta hurry. The drivers paid us to have these eaten by the end of the day." And I always thought that was funny. But yeah, I liked the Orange Show. It was a fun track to go to. But then I remember a lot of times there would be an altercation on the track. I'd run to the top of the stands to look over in the pits to watch the fight. That was a common thing there at the Orange Show, was the fights.
What'd you do in the 80s?
The 80s I started traveling around more. That's when we went to... They used to do a series at the end of the year where you'd run Craig Road, Orange Show, Saugus, El Cajon, and I think when they built Mesa Marin, joined in at the end of the year. And that's when all the guys from the East Coast would come out in the fall classics. Larry Gershman should remember those. Jim Thurkettle ran a lot of those. What did they call them? It's just like a Western swing thing and that's where that's where I saw Larry Phillips. Mark Martin came out one year and ran them, because the guys from the Midwest and back east, their seasons were done. So they'd come out here in the fall and race with us. And they had a race at Craig Road Speedway one year, I remember. They had a $150,000 purse. They had like 200 cars show up for this race. It was a heck of a race. I can't remember. I think Larry Phillips won it. If not, it was either him or Larry Deachens.
Qualifying take like 2 days.
Yeah, it was interesting.
That was all asphalt?
Yeah, it was a little quarter-mile asphalt track. It's been closed. I want to say the last race they ran there was in the early 80s. They might have ran up 83, 84, something like that. Housing moved in, development moved in, and it just became too much trouble to run the track anymore, so they closed down. It was a fun place to race.
Back in the 70s, what was your first hauler like?
My first hauler?
Pickup truck and an open trailer? Or
the red pickup truck you saw.
That went out there?
I bought that truck when I was in high school, senior in high school, and that's what I took my dad's old trailer, and it was pretty dilapidated when he had finished racing, and we refurbished it and the little red pickup truck, and we'd pile in the truck and go racing.
What year is that thing?
75.
75 Chevy?
Yeah, 75 Chevy half-ton pickup truck. And back then we'd overload it and go to the races.
Open trailer?
Open trailer, that's all we had.
Toolbox in the back?
Toolbox in the back.
Make sure you have the gate up?
Yep. Yep.
Any notable stories? Anything come to mind when you think of the 70s, the early years?
Just that end of the year season series that would show up, watching the East Coast guys come out with their cars and the way they built them and raced them compared to the West Coast cars. That was real interesting to see that comparison. The whole different kind of car almost. The East Coast guys used more parts out of a junkyard, you want to say, where the West Coast cars had, full built chassis, and they were just more chrome and shiny stuff on them. Guys from the East Coast, you could tell they raced the heck out of them cars. That impressed me. I remember the first time I saw Larry Phillips's car, and it had dirt tires on it when they got here. They had run it on a dirt track prior to coming here with it, and they had taken the dirt tires off, put paved tires on, and raced it.
Phillips, that's not the...
Larry...
I'm thinking of Fett. Phillips?
Terry Phillips, his father.
Was
Larry
that the 08?
Terry runs a 75 car. Larry, his dad, ran the 75 car. If you look up Larry Phillips, I think he's one of the guys that's won more NASCAR national championships. Like, I want to say 7-time, 8-time NASCAR national champion, maybe more than that. But he was like one of the guys to beat in the West Coast, or in the whole country as far as short track racing went. If you look up Larry Phillips, he's pretty famous, I think.
So the West Coast guys pretty much dominated?
Oh, no.
No?
No. Most of those races were won by the East Coast guys. A guy named Larry Deachens was very dominant. Larry Phillips was dominant. Who else was? Trickle didn't do so well when he came out here, but Mark Martin did pretty good. I remember him; he ran well. Don Biederman was another one that ran very well. They raced. The difference, West Coast guys ran maybe 16, 18 races a year. Those guys in the Midwest, they raced 30, 40 races a year.
Every weekend.
Yeah. And you can put guys in racing, you can put guys in the same equipment, but the guy that runs 40 to 60 races a year, as opposed to the guy that runs maybe 16, 18 races, experience, just that practice. They're going to be faster and better. And it showed, you could tell the guys. Now, I know Jim Thurkettle was one of the guys that was very fast back then. He held his own with those guys. A guy named Jimmy Insolo, both Ron Esau was pretty fast back then. He held his own.
Back then it was the two sons and the dad, right?
Yeah. Larry, George, Ron. They all raced the Orange Show, the old 605. Sonny Easley was fast before he got killed at Riverside. He was kind of one of my I want to say growing up heroes. He was always fast, always clean. His cars were always well taken care of, and he just ran real well. And he come from the Thurkettle, Dan Press, Kenny Sapper, Don Knoll, all those guys that ran over at Saugus back in the, I want to say, late 70s, early 80s. Some of them go even back into the 60s, some of them, like Don Knoll, I think, ran in the 60s, the old Winston West stuff. I got a memory on some of that, because I grew up as a kid. Those guys were bigger than life. When you're just a kid, it's like amazing to see those guys race.
I remember Baldwin and Spencer.
Ivan Baldwin.
I really liked Spencer.
Yeah. I have a picture in my collection of Ivan Baldwin's Nova that he ran. But I remember as a kid watching him run the 57 Chevys. Ivan the Terrible, they called him. He was a heck of a driver.
Have you seen that tribute car that some
Yes.
guy brings to?
I saw that car. That's pretty
nice.
cool.
First time I saw that, my jaw hit the ground.
As soon as I saw that, I knew exactly what car that was. Exactly what car that was.
What classes were you running in the 80s?
I ran the limited stocks for 3 years, and then I moved up and they called them Grand Nationals. They were, what would be your sportsman cars today.
The Grand Nationals, was that an early version of this?
No, they were, my next car when I built the 65 Chevelle was my first car. The next car I built was a Camaro, and it was a tube chassis car. And one guy crashed a car in the back and was throwing the chassis away, and another guy crashed a car in the front. They were throwing them away, so I scrounged them up, cut them apart, and put the